So let me give you an idea of what I mean by the necessary and proper clause and how it is that Congress has a power that's not granted to them. Now again, we refer to these as the implied powers. The idea is that in Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers, they list powers that are expressly given to Congress. There's no doubt. It says, like, right here, Congress, you have the ability to do this. But there are some things that aren't listed that Congress has that power too. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. There was a Supreme Court decision a long time ago called McCulloch versus Maryland. And I'm not going to get into the details of this because you don't need to know the details. You just need to understand the concept. Back in the day, the federal government created something called the Bank of the United States. It was actually the second Bank of the United States. Don't worry. Now it's not the Bank of America because the Bank of America is a private business. Right, that's a private company. This was the Bank of the United States. This was the United States, and this is where they kept their money. It was a bank that was owned by the federal government. Well, apparently some people weren't too happy about the fact that the federal government was opening up a bank in Maryland. Apparently this bank, not only was it holding the money for the United States, but it was competing with other banks. And it was creating a problem. And there were some people who said, wait a minute. The federal government can't create a bank. I've read the enumerated powers. There's nowhere in there that says the federal government has the authority to create a bank. It's not one of the express powers. It's not one of the enumerated powers, and therefore it doesn't exist. The federal government shouldn't be able to do that. Congress shouldn't be able to do that. And so the federal government opened up the bank, and the state of Maryland essentially started to tax the federal government. And the federal government said, you can't tax us. We're the federal government. You're a state. You can't tax us. And so it wound up being that the government of Maryland sued and said they wanted money from the federal government. The federal government said no. And so there was this court case. When the Supreme Court finally made their decision, this is what they said. They said, first, the state governments can't tax the federal government. One of the things that they said was the power to tax somebody is basically the power to destroy. That if you say the states can tax the federal government, they'll just tax the hell out of them, tax them into, where they won't even exist any longer. And they also said, and this is the important part of the necessary and proper clause, is that the federal government has what they called implied powers. That there are certain powers that aren't expressly given to the federal government, to Congress in this case, but they have certain implied powers. So, for example, in the enumerated powers, it says that Congress has the power to regulate currency and the value of money. And so the argument was that if Congress feels like it's necessary to have a bank in order to do the things that they've been told they have the power to do, what the court was saying is, well, you have that power too. So on your notes, I have this question. Does the Constitution give Congress the authority to create a bank? Well, there are two answers. No, there's nothing listed in the enumerated powers that says Congress has the authority to create a bank. It's not in there anywhere. You can look on that list, pretty expansive list. There's nothing in there. So that's the no part of the equation. So no, there's no expressed power given to Congress to create a bank. But there's also a yes answer too. And that's what the courts were saying. That there are certain powers that are implied. That Congress has certain powers that if they need to create a bank, for example, in order to carry out things that they've been given responsibility to do, then they can go ahead and they can do that. And so that's the idea behind the necessary and proper clause. Now, so if there are any questions about that, if you're not sure about that, one thing you can do is click on the link that says to McCulloch in Maryland, and there's like a very short explanation of the case, and that might help clarify things that you don't understand. Alternatively, what you can do is just write this down. McCulloch versus Maryland, didn't quite get it. And when we talk next, you can go ahead and ask me a question, and I'll try and explain it better. Or we'll do it that way. Or what you can do is you can go ahead and type something on the discussion board. Now, so that's talking about so we've talked about the express powers given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8. The state governments were also very powerful and supposed to be important in our system. And the power granted to the state government comes from the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is sometimes referred to as the Reservation Clause. And let me just read you what the 10th Amendment says, and then what I'll do is I'll explain what it means. The 10th Amendment of the Constitution says, all powers not delegated to the national government, nor prohibited to it by the Constitution, belong to the state governments and the people thereof. What does that mean? We'll start off with the idea that all governments have to exercise power. There are certain things that every government has to do to exercise power. What the 10th Amendment says is the Constitution grants specific powers to the national government, certain things the national government can do. And the Constitution prohibits states from exercising certain powers, and we'll talk about that in a second. There are certain things that states can't do. All other powers, everything doesn't fall into those two categories, belongs to the people, or belongs to the states. All other powers not mentioned are reserved for the states. So anything that's not mentioned in the Constitution, where the federal government is given the power, or where states are told they can't do something, everything else belongs to the states. And that's a large grant of power. So just for a couple of examples, and you'll see why I use these examples. Each state gets to decide whether or not certain medicines can be sold within their state. If Arizona wants to allow one drug, that doesn't mean that California has to allow the same thing. They can each make their own rules, and the federal government can't tell them, you have to do this, because there's nowhere in the Constitution that gives the federal government the authority to regulate the medicines that a state uses. And if there's nothing in there saying the federal government could do it, and there's nothing in there telling the states they can't do it, then the states can do it. Defining what marriage is. There's nowhere in the Constitution that gives the federal government the right to determine what marriage is. That's a state thing. When it comes to educational policy, there's nothing in the federal government there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the federal government the authority to go ahead and determine educational policy. Once again, if it's not something that's given to the national government, and it's not something that the states are prohibited from doing, then it belongs to the states. And then lastly, determining the legal drinking age. Once again, that's something that belongs just to the federal government. Just to the state governments. These are all things that just belong to the state governments. Now, we'll come back to these things in a moment, and you'll see why I've brought these particular ones up. But first, I want to talk about some other powers. There are some powers that are called concurrent powers. These are shared powers, powers that both the federal government and the state governments exercise. Concurrent is the word we use. It just means shared. Things that they, if two governments are doing something concurrently, that means they're doing it at the same time. So there are certain powers that the federal government has and the state government has at the same time. So, for example, the power to tax. We get taxed at the federal level, we get taxed at the state level. The federal government has the authority to make and enforce laws, federal laws. The state has the authority to make and enforce state laws. The federal government can create courts. Actually, Congress can create courts. At the state level, states can create courts. There's a whole bunch of powers that both the federal government has and the state government has. Both of them regulate air quality in different ways. Both of them regulate a bunch of different things. Then there are certain powers that we call prohibited powers, things that can't be done. For example, the Constitution says that the national government cannot tax exports. If countries are exporting things to other countries, the federal government can't say, okay, you know what, if you're going to be selling cars to Korea, we're going to tax every car that you sell. Not allowed to do that. The Constitution says you can't do that. When the Congress is going in and regulating interstate commerce, trade between states, and trade that goes in between states, Congress has to treat all states exactly the same. It can't go ahead and say, well, these are the rules for California, these are rules for Rhode Island, these are the rules for somewhere else. All states have to be treated the same. And when it comes to state governments, there are certain things that the state governments can't do. For example, states can't coin money. That's why we don't have California dollars, Nevada, dollars, Texas dollars. Only the federal government can go ahead and coin money to make currency. States can't enter into treaties or alliances with foreign countries. California can't sign a treaty with Canada. And they cannot keep troops or engage in war unless they're attacked. If they're invaded, then they can. But they can't keep an army. There can't be a California army. There is a National Guard, but that can be nationalized. The federal government, the national government can go ahead and take those over. So those are some of the prohibited powers. Now, on the next video, what we're going to talk about is the relationship between the national government and the state governments.